The Disenthral dimension. You know, I never thought when I was playing lead guitar that the spirituality of it was more important than the actual extrapolation in the anatomical sense. I thought that because the nuances and the expression of the language of the electric guitar was so wild and frenzied, that it left no room for any more expression in any other instrument. I figured the electric guitar is it. That's it, because, the violin in its serenity and in its graceful states, in its cooperative inclusion within the symphony, represented the plurality of the instrument in mass, whereas the electric guitar in its isolation was essentially a rival thereof. And, I thought, well, if the twain could come together, but little did I understand that it was not the twain that came together, it was the oppositional standpoint that created the Disenthral dimension. So in a historical standpoint, if you go way, 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 way back, you go to where the luthiers were essentially in experimentation with the anatomics of the instrument and the postures and in the methodologies and so forth, which predetermined the course of action with reference to the violin and the classical guitar and so forth, because the constituents or the elements thereof were essentially the same, similar, until it split, sort of like mitosis would be. But what they didn't see was that there was this animosity that was growing between the two genres. And that animosity was the shunning of the classical guitar and the codependency of the symphony, whereas now you just don't see the classical guitar in the symphony, and that is the reason in being there's sort of like a pariah. And this pariah then went into a state of isolation and then came out in the form of the electric guitar as a rival to the codependency and the inclusion of the plurality of all of the essential instruments of the symphony, which the classical guitar was not considered. And Segovia, being the master and the activist basically in bringing the old master's compositions out through the classical guitar, and of course the expertise of the man. So by the time I was born in the world, all of this had already taken place, and I was completely, in a deluge of spirituality, in that I wasn't being fulfilled by the dissension between the two genres, because it was just one was fighting against the other, and I couldn't understand that. And even though there were other, factions like Tommy with the Who, that was, they brought together basically electronics with natural inherencies, I was still perplexed by the fact that it still seemed to be fighting one against the other, in that this just seemed to be almost like this chess game going on, and I could not figure out why they were both two opposing sides to this. So gradually, as I began to enter more into the laws of the universe, I began to see that there were disparities with reference to the human being, with reference to the nature of what makes a human being in the time and space elements. So if you have a displacement, per se, in the astrological disorder or the astrological assimilation of reality, you begin to understand that that reality is coming from a cosmic standpoint according to the laws of physics, which then enter into Pythagoras, and Pythagoras then brings about the importance of the numbers. The numbers then bring the esoteric region involved, because you see, if you look at numbers from a three-dimensional standpoint, you're not looking at it from the esoteric standpoint. The numbers in the esoteric standpoint provide a metaphysical understanding of the laws of the universe, as opposed to 2 + 2 = 4. So that's when you begin to understand that numbers are a symbolic representation of reality. And that symbolic representation of reality can be understood better by bringing in the spirituality of mankind into the numerical sequence. And that spirituality, ergo, translates into the audible spirituality of music. So in other words, when I said at one point that a picture is worth 1,000 words, it's the form of music that interprets the understanding of those 1,000 words that are located in that picture. And that's essentially a word, it's called esperance. I don't know why they took it out of the dictionary, but apparently it was so antiquated and clandestine that they decided not to create the colloquial definition of something that now doesn't exist where it should have. The word esperance is the perfection of mankind in his spirituality. That is the word. mankind shall not reach true esperance until he attains perfection. And that perfection has to come from a spiritual standpoint. So, going back into my musical mind, I thought of how to bring about the astrological equivalent of what music represents. And in that, I began to see that there was a time displacement with reference to the electric guitar and the ancient classical guitar. And that time displacement found its way all the way back in the viols. And the viols were basically instruments that were in the similitude of themselves, and then in the experimentation of themselves became an assimilitude. And that assimilitude then became a disenthral dimension between two different forms of methodology, that one was essentially bowing and the other one was plucking. And the plucking and the bowing became a sort of like this misunderstanding between both as to the necessity or the need thereof for that methodology in the symphony, and so forth. So that the instruments then became like a hierarchy, where the violin was at the top, and then instruments started to cascade down. And that's why you have, in the order of the hierarchy of the musical instruments, the classical guitar is way at the bottom. Now, why would that be? The reason why is because there was a misunderstanding, a dissenthral dimension that was created because the electric guitar had to evolve itself into another separate genre according to electricity. And that electricity was not deemed, because of the systemic part of the plethora of post-emulation or devices, an instrument of a system rather than in singularity. That's why the classical guitar giving way to the electric guitar was still inconclusive in the natural inherency of the return of the instrument to the symphony through the Trillo, being that the Trillo is an isolate singularity, the same as the violin. So that's why it's the infant of the symphony, because it is the product of the dissenthral dimension brought back into the assimilation of a natural inherent instrument that brings the two instruments into an understanding of each other.